It was a sweltering summer night on a deserted stretch of highway in rural Briarwood. The air was heavy and suffocating, the asphalt still radiating the day's heat. Officer Blake Harrison sat in his patrol car, his radar gun resting idly on his lap, eyes scanning the dimly lit road ahead. In Somerville County, where not much ever happened, traffic stops were his stage, his opportunity to assert his authority. He wasn't just looking for speeders, he was looking for someone to remind of her somewhere. A few miles away, Dr. Alana Price was driving her charcoal gray sedan home after a long visit with her elderly aunt. The steady hum of the tires on the pavement was almost lulling, but exhaustion weighed heavy on her eyelids. She had spent days arranging in home care, ensuring medications were stocked. Food supplies were ample, and everything was set before she left. Alana was tall and graceful, her warm brown skin glowing under the soft light of the dashboard. Her mind drifted between thoughts of her aunt and the stack of patient files waiting for her in Washington, D.C., where she worked as an internal medicine physician. But what few people knew, Alana was also a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve, assigned to a specialized medical logistics unit that liaised directly with the Pentagon. The sudden flash of red and blue lights snapped her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. She checked the speedometer, only about 3 miles over the limit. With a sigh, she flicked on her turn signal and pulled onto the gravel shoulder. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, "Stay calm. Keep both hands on the wheel." He had been an Air Force colonel and had drilled that into her from the moment she was old enough to drive. Through the rearview mirror, she watched the officer step out of his vehicle, broad shoulders, heavy boots crunching against the gravel, flashlight already in hand. Blake Harrison, his reputation preceded him, though Alana had never heard of him before tonight. He swaggered up to her window, shining the flashlight directly into her eyes. "License and registration," he barked. Alana squinted, keeping both hands visible. "Of course, officer. May I ask why I was stopped?" He ignored her, snatching the documents from her hand. She could hear the disdain in the way he flipped through them. "Alana Price, Washington, D.C., he read aloud, his tone laced with suspicion. "You know you were going 10 over the limit." "I believe it was only a few miles over," Alana replied, her voice calm. He narrowed his eyes. "Anything in the car I should know about? Drugs? Weapons?" "No, officer." "Step out of the vehicle." Her stomach clenched, fear creeping up her chest, tightening her breath. She carefully opened the door, every movement slow and deliberate, as if one wrong move could make things spiral out of control. The thick night air wrapped around her, yet her skin felt cold with tension. Her feet met the ground, the tiny pebbles shifting slightly beneath her shoes, making the only sound in the oppressive silence. The officer stood before her, his silhouette cast onto the pavement by the patrol car's harsh lights. Blake motioned with his head, a slow, authoritative nod. Hands on the hood, his voice was low, firm, and commanding. Alana hesitated, her fingers curling slightly as if her body resisted. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She knew he knew it too. But out here, on this desolate road, it was just her and him, no witnesses, no one to speak up for her if things went too far. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to comply. Her hands pressed against the cold metal of the hood, the chill seeping through her sleeves, reaching her spine. Blake's hands began patting her down roughly and unnecessarily. Alana's throat went dry as his fingers moved along her arms, down her sides, then over her thighs. Every touch sent a numbing sensation across her skin, her muscles tightening instinctively. He found nothing. But instead of stopping, he stepped back, circling around her car like a predator sizing up its prey. The car door clicked open. He hadn't asked for permission, no explanation. The glove compartment was yanked open, the cup holder inspected, his hand even reaching under the seat, as if he was desperate to find something, anything to justify his actions. Alana clenched her jaw, and her breathing quickened. With every passing second, her anger swelled. He had no legitimate reason for this. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. This was humiliation. This was an abuse of power. She wanted to speak up, to demand he stop, to ask for an explanation. But out here, on a dark road in Briarwood, She knew she couldn't afford to take that risk. Instead of reacting rashly, Alana slowly moved her hands, trying to steady her breath. Every muscle in her body was tense, but she understood that one wrong move could escalate the situation dangerously. She swallowed down the fury rising inside her, forcing herself not to act on instinct. Slowly, she slid a hand into her coat pocket, fingers searching for the familiar shape of her phone. The cool screen met her fingertips, and she realized her hand was trembling. A deep sense of unease settled in her chest. Only one thought echoed in her mind: someone needs to know about this. She inhaled deeply, keeping her voice as calm as possible. "Officer, I'm making a phone call." Blake Harrison crossed his arms, leaning against her car, a smirk playing on his lips. "Be my guest." His voice dripped with mockery as if he was enjoying the game. She didn't respond, her focus on scrolling through her contacts. Her finger hovered over a familiar name, Colonel Evelyn Monroe. Without hesitation, she pressed the call button. After 2 rings, a sharp, authoritative voice came through the line. "Lieutenant Colonel Price, is something wrong?" Just hearing that voice was enough to steady her. "I've been pulled over by a local officer," she said, keeping her tone measured. "He refuses to acknowledge my identification. I may need assistance." The moment those words left her lips, she saw the shift in Harrison's expression. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he quickly masked it with arrogance. "You think I care about some high-ranking official?" He scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. She didn't need to answer. A second later, Colonel Monroe's voice cut through the night, sharp and undeniable. "This is Colonel Evelyn Monroe, United States Department of Defense. Officer, state your name immediately." Harrison swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed as he hesitated, but then he finally spoke. "Officer Blake Harrison, Somerville County." "Very well, Officer Harrison." Monroe's voice remained icy. "She is a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. You must release her immediately. If you don't, you will have to answer to the Pentagon for obstructing a federal officer." The arrogance drained from Harrison's face. His jaw clenched, and his eyes darted around as if searching for an escape route. After a moment, with a trembling hand, he shoved the phone back into Alana's palm, avoiding her gaze. "You can go," he muttered, his voice tight. Alana stared at him for a moment, saying nothing. There was no need to thank him. He hadn't done her a favor. He had simply realized his power wasn't absolute. Turning away, she walked briskly to her car. As she shut the door, she noticed her hands were still slightly shaking. Her heart pounded in her chest as she started the engine and drove away. Minutes later, once she was far from the traffic stop, she took a deep breath. A heavy weight settled on her chest as she grasped just how close she had come to danger. What if she hadn't had connections at the Pentagon? What if her call hadn't been answered? Those questions haunted her for the rest of the drive. And even though she knew she was safe, she kept glancing in the rearview mirror just to be sure. In town, the fallout came swiftly, like a storm sweeping through and uprooting everything in its path. Alana did not stay silent. She filed an official complaint, and this time she wasn't alone. The Pentagon did not take lightly the harassment of one of their officers, especially not on American soil, by someone sworn to uphold the law rather than abuse it. The Somerville County Sheriff's Office was thrown into chaos. The press swarmed in, activists called for justice, and the media pounced on the story of female lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army was unlawfully searched and humiliated by a local police officer who treated her as a suspect simply because of her skin color. But the real blow landed when dashcam footage leaked online. There was Blake Harrison, his voice cold, his movements rough, his eyes gleaming with smug authority, everything captured in stark clarity. Undeniable. Inexcusable. Public outrage exploded. Locals who had once trusted their police force began to question everything. Civil rights organizations took action. Blake Harrison was suspended pending investigation. His badge was stripped and his gun confiscated. A man who had once carried power in every step now found himself a pariah. The media firestorm drowned him in negative headlines, interviews, and scathing critiques. The suspension was humiliating, but being abandoned by the very town he had once commanded was what truly scorched his pride. But Blake Harrison wasn't the type to let go easily. Alana tried to return to a normal life, but she knew nothing would ever be the same. She decided to stay at her aunt's house longer, not just to take care of her but to keep a low profile. She told herself she had done the right thing, that she had fought for justice. And yet the unease never fully left her. Every time she stepped outside, she could feel eyes following her. Sometimes she had the eerie sensation that someone was watching her. A strange car parked near her house for too long. A shadow flickered at the street corner. A chill ran down her spine despite the sweltering heat. And then she realized she wasn't being paranoid. Blake Harrison, stripped of his badge and his reputation in ruins, had no intention of accepting defeat. His anger hadn't subsided. Instead, it burned hotter than ever. He blamed her for everything: his suspension, becoming the center of a media storm, the humiliation of facing his colleagues and the public. To him, Alana wasn't a victim. She was the enemy. And an enemy deserved payback. A week later, Alana decided to leave town. She had stayed longer than planned, but now it was time to return to Washington, D.C. She packed her bags and double-checked everything before heading out. As her car sped down the empty road leading out of town, she felt a sense of relief. No more prying eyes, no more feeling watched. But the peace didn't last. In the rearview mirror, she noticed a pickup truck appear. At first, she didn't think much of it. This highway often had trucks passing through. But when it continued to tail her persistently, unease crept in. She changed lanes. The truck changed lanes. She slowed down. It slowed down. She sped up. It kept pace. Her heartbeat quickened. Her breaths grew heavier. She tried to stay calm, keeping her eyes on the mirror. The truck drew closer, its headlights glaring in her rearview mirror. Then, without warning, it swerved and rammed into the back of her car. The impact sent her car jolting violently. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, struggling to keep control. But before she could react, the truck rammed her again, this time, slamming into the side of her vehicle. Her tires skidded on the gravel shoulder. The car wobbled, losing traction. Panic surged through her as she wrestled with the wheel, desperately trying to keep from veering off the road. But the truck didn't stop. It struck her car again, harder this time, with ruthless intent. Adrenaline surged through her veins as Alana's car buckled and lurched across the rough asphalt. Her right tire lost grip, sliding off the pavement. She screamed as the car spun, skidding sideways into the thick grass lining the roadside. A screeching sound tore through the night as metal scraped against the earth. Then, after what felt like an eternity of chaos, the car finally came to a stop amid the tall grass. The engine died. The only sound left was her ragged breathing, mingling with the distant hum of insects in the night. She trembled, hands still clenching the wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the rearview mirror. The truck was gone. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone. 911. What's your emergency? I was just run off the road by Blake Harrison. He's dangerous. I need help now. The dispatcher's voice remained calm but firm. Emergency units are on their way. Stay on the line. Alana locked her doors, heart racing, watching the truck linger for a moment before finally speeding off into the darkness. Minutes later, the wail of sirens shattered the night stillness as state troopers arrived at the scene. Behind them, an ambulance pulled up, its red lights flashing against the darkness. Paramedics rushed to Alana, checking her for injuries. Though her body was covered in bruises from the attack, she was fortunate no serious injuries. They offered to take her to the hospital for further evaluation, but with her unwavering resilience, she insisted she could take care of herself. Once assured of Alana's safety, law enforcement wasted no time launching a full-scale manhunt for Harrison. A massive search was mobilized, involving state police, the FBI, and special tactical units. They combed through every mile of road, checked every house, every motel, and every remote hideout where he might be hiding. Roadblocks were set up on all exits out of the county, while helicopters circled overhead, using infrared cameras to track any movement. After 2 tense days, they found Harrison hiding in an abandoned warehouse deep in the woods outside the county line. As law enforcement surrounded the area, the air grew heavy with anticipation. He knew he was cornered, but he refused to surrender. The arrest was intense and dramatic. When officers stormed the warehouse, Harrison fought back viciously, attempting to flee through the back door. But he didn't get far. Officers had already cut off every escape route. He struggled, trying to fight his way out. But within seconds, an officer tackled him to the ground. The cold snap of handcuffs around his wrists marked the end of the chase. The charges against him were swiftly brought forward: assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice at the federal level. As he was escorted to the police car, Harrison no longer carried the arrogance he once had. He hung his head, knowing that his life would now be bound by prison bars. Meanwhile, Alana could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The nightmare had come to an end. But she knew that even though Harrison had been arrested, the trauma of what had happened would haunt her for years to come. Alana returned to Washington, D.C., carrying not only the fading bruises on her skin, but also the deep, invisible scars etched into her mind. The nightmare didn't end when she left the detention center or when Blake Harrison was taken into custody. It followed her into her sleep, into the quiet moments when she was alone. Questions spiraled in her mind. If she hadn't been a high-ranking officer, if she hadn't had connections within the Pentagon, would she have been rescued in time? Or would she have become just another forgotten name, an anonymous statistic in the long list of victims of abuse of power? But her story was not forgotten. It spread across newspapers, television, and social media, not just as a case of police misconduct, but as a glaring exposure of systemic abuse of power, the kind that men like Blake Harrison had exploited for years. The public was outraged, activists spoke out, and extensive investigations were launched. Alana did not stay silent. She couldn't. She stood in front of cameras, in interviews, in courtrooms, and at community discussions. Her voice was unwavering, her gaze sharp as she spoke of justice, fairness, and the fragile line between power and prejudice. She didn't speak just to tell her story. She spoke to remind everyone that if this could happen to her, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, it could happen to anyone. And Blake Harrison, he lost everything. His badge was stripped away. The police uniform he once took pride in became nothing more than a distant memory. He was convicted and sentenced to prison, and most importantly, he lost the illusion that his power was absolute. But Alana's victory was not a light one. What she gained was heavier: the burden of knowing she had come dangerously close to being yet another victim in the endless list of those who had suffered from abuse of power. More than anything, she realized her responsibility, the duty to speak out, to take action, to ensure that fewer and fewer people would have to endure what she had been through. And sometimes, in the late hours of the night, driving along empty highways, with only the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of her heartbeat filling the silence, Alana would glance into the rearview mirror just to be sure that no one was following, that the ghosts of the past had truly been left behind. In the end, this story was not just about a confrontation between a police officer and an innocent woman. It was a harsh reminder of the abuse of power, the deep-seated prejudices in society, and the fragility of justice when placed in the hands of the undeserving. Without her rank, without her connections to people in power, what would have happened to Vanessa Holloway? And if this could happen to her, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, what injustices were still being suffered by those without status, without protection from the system? What do we learn from this story? Justice does not exist on its own. It must be defended, fought for, and reinforced every single day. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. No matter who you are, you have a responsibility to speak out when you see injustice happening, because if we ignore it today or tomorrow, the victim could be us or someone we love. The year is 2025. We can no longer just stand by and hope things will change. Ask questions. Demand transparency from those in power. Support organizations fighting for social justice. Never stop educating yourself and those around you about the rights and responsibilities of every citizen. And if you have a story to tell, an injustice to expose, don't be afraid to share it. Awareness and action from individuals are what will drive systemic change. So 5 years from now, in 2030, where will we be? Will we be able to look back and see that our efforts today led to real change? Or will we remain stuck in the cycle of apathy and despair? The answer depends on what we do now. A more just society, a more transparent justice system, is not a distant dream. It begins with the commitment of each and every one of us, through even the smallest but most persistent actions. And you, what do you think about this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation doesn't end here. It is the first step toward a bigger change. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard, hit the subscribe button to continue this journey with us in exposing injustice and spreading the message of justice. This story is entirely fictional, created with the purpose of raising awareness about critical social issues. We aim to highlight personal and collective responsibility, the spirit of justice, and the importance of treating all individuals with respect and dignity, regardless of their race, status, or circumstances. We firmly oppose all forms of violence, discrimination, prejudice, and injustice in society. The events in this story may be emotionally intense and serve an educational purpose, encouraging viewers to reflect on moral values, fairness, and compassion. Viewers should consider the emotional impact before proceeding. If you find the content distressing, please assess it carefully before continuing. We hope this story will contribute to meaningful discussions and help build a more just and compassionate society.